There'll be some similarities and some differences between a Trump 2.0 and a Harris 1.0. Certainly, if Donald Trump were to return to the White House, you would see going back to an America first foreign policy, leaving alliances to some degree and going at it one-on-one bilaterally with countries. President Harris, President Harris would continue the Biden approach, which is, this lattice work approach, working in and weaving all of these different relationships in the Asia Pacific. So broad differences there. Look, the U.S.-China relationship is on a downward trajectory. That is going to remain regardless of who wins. Of course, Donald Trump would take it to a much higher degree if he were to return to the White House than if Vice President Harris were to become President Harris.
As you say, with that America First approach, Donald Trump appears more likely to escalate trade tensions between the US and China. Now, he's already proposing more tariffs, including, I understand, a 60% tariff on all Chinese imports. How concerned is Beijing about this?
Well, I think everybody is concerned about this because not only is Donald Trump talking about a 60% tariff from goods from China to the U.S., he's talking about a 10 to 20% tariff on goods from everywhere in the world to the United States. So this would have a major impact globally on trade. It would have a major impact on economies throughout the world. And certainly for those U.S. companies that source in China, which is a large number of U.S. companies, that would have a big impact on them. So there is a lot of concern of such an increase in tariffs. You're going to see an increase in tariffs under a President Harris as well. But what Donald Trump is talking about is unprecedented, a 60% across the board, and it would have major economic consequences.
Many US allies in the region look to Washington for support where security is concerned, holding joint military drills with Washington and countering maritime threats as well. Do you think this will continue status quo under either a Trump or Harris administration?
There are going to be differences between the two. Donald Trump takes a much more transactional approach to alliances than would President Harris. And so Donald Trump is going to ask himself, for example, when it comes to the U.S. alliance with South Korea, is South Korea paying enough money to the United States for the troops that are in South Korea? And if they're not, maybe he will pull those troops out, which could have a destabilizing impact on the Korean Peninsula, in North Asia, and across the region. So it's going to be much more transactional, whereas you see a much more working with partners and allies approach from a Harris administration. It's not absolute, but it would be much more in keeping with what you see now. Look, for both, you would expect AUKUS, the Australia, US, UK military agreement to continue. So there are certain commonalities, but no, it is going to be much more transactional, and trade and economics, and especially trade deficits, are going to drive security under a Trump administration more than they would a Harris administration.
And how closely do you think Taiwan is watching this election? How will the results impact its management of security threats?
Generally speaking, the U.S. approach to Taiwan has remained consistent across Republican and Democratic administrations, whether, having that one China policy, but with strategic ambiguity. That has always been the hallmark of U.S. foreign policy when it comes to Taiwan and the Straits. It could change under Donald Trump. No one would expect that to change under a President Harris, but it could change under Donald Trump. That's not the base case. The base case is it would remain the same, but it is something that governments and companies are all watching, investors are watching. Will there be a significant change when it comes to the Trump administration? Would it become more transactional towards Taiwan? Would a Trump administration be willing to negotiate about Taiwan with China, which it has never done before? So those are certainly things to watch.
Do you think there are particular countries here in Asia who have a particular preference over who wins at the November election?
I don't know that anybody has a preference. Certainly, the officials I've talked to said, look, the U.S. is going to do what it's going to do, and we're going to react. But they're preparing very differently. And if you certainly look in Southeast Asia, where in Trump's first administration, he looked through the prism of trade deficits when it came to countries. He looked at Vietnam primarily through a trade deficit perspective, as opposed to how important Vietnam is geostrategically as it needs to balance between the U.S. and China. If you go back to Donald Trump and you go back to looking at bilateral relationships through a trade deficit, Vietnam is going to have to approach its relationship with the U.S. very differently. Malaysia is going to have to approach its relationship with the U.S. very differently. Any country with a trade deficit is going to have to approach its relationship very differently with the U.S. under Trump than it would Harris.
Steven Okun, thank you so much for making those comparisons for us. We look forward to seeing the outcome in November. Thank you.
Thank you.